Thank you, everyone, for coming. I'm Joe Carlsmith, of course. Joe Carlsmith works at Open Philanthropy, where he thinks about AI and ethics and the future. And today he's going to be talking about can goodness compete? What the long-run equilibria looks like after AGI.
Okay. Hi. Thanks for coming. So, can goodness compete? It's a classic question, and it crops up constantly in a certain strand of futurism. So I'm going to try to analyze it and understand it more precisely. And in particular, I want to distinguish between a few different variants, some of which are more, I think, fundamental as problems than others. And then I want to try to hone in on what I see as the hardest version of the problem. And in particular, possible ways good values can have inherent disadvantages in competition with other value systems. For example, locust-like value systems that only care about growing and consuming resources as fast as possible. So that's what I'm going to say is the kind of the hardest problem. But there's a bunch of other versions of the problem that I want to talk about too. And I want to kind of stare at some of the scary trade-offs that I think this problem can create. So that's the broad plan here. To say a little bit more about what I'm talking about, there's this broad vibe. Now, this is not going to be very precise, but I want to give you the vibe. And then we can get into the nitty-gritty. So the vibe is something like this. Competition. Well, what wins competition? Power. And power is famously, unfortunately, not the same as goodness. So, implication, maybe, every opportunity to sacrifice goodness for the sake of power makes you more likely to win. So if the future involves a lot of competition, then goodness loses. That's the vibe. Now, noticeably, this is all very, very abstract. What on earth, what do these words mean? Winning, competition, goodness. Let's be wary of the degree of abstraction here. Let's like kind of, I don't know, stay on our toes. It's going to be an abstract talk. It's going to be a weird futurism talk. There's going to be a lot of stuff that isn't pinned down. And that's not good. I'm not saying that's good. But work with me. And see if we can do better together. Okay, so there's a certain kind of lineage of futurism that I think is just pervasively concerned about variants of can goodness compete. I put a bunch of citations here. I'm actually excluding the entire edifice of like technical AI alignment. I'm going to talk about that in a second. But there's a whole extra strand. Kind of descended from the Future of Humanity Institute and kind of prior to that to some extent that I think is concerned about the problem that I'm going to talk about here. And we see it cropping up all over the place in the contemporary AI discourse as well. Notably, also, I think if you see people talk about like, AI, it's just capitalism, or it's somehow the same as capitalism. I think that's actually often expressive of a certain variant of the concern that I'm going to be talking about here as well. Okay, so what do I mean by goodness? Well, you know what I mean. Maybe you don't. Maybe I don't know what I mean, but it doesn't matter that much, I'm hoping. So the main point is this thing where power is not it, or at least not it conceptually, right? So we can at least admit conceptually that might is distinct from right. Yeah, like these could be different. They're not the same concepts. Empirically, maybe they come together in some ways. Maybe there's some like fancy conceptual analysis you can do to get from one to the other. But like starting point, they're different. Okay, so that's the main thing. Now, but in particular, to give you some flavor of the type of thing we're worried about here, so classic aspects of goodness that people are worried about include consciousness, often thought good, if in certain cases, pleasure, beauty, leisure, concern for the weak, prevention of suffering, adequate reflection on the good itself. That one's a little meta, but you know. Okay, and so the basic nightmare here is you have some sort of hyper-competition. Who knows what that means, but there's hyper-competition. And it grinds away all these things, because in some sense, these things are inefficient, right? So like, you know how if you work at a really intense job, then they don't give you vacation maybe, or they give you only just enough vacation? That's the kind of thing, but that for consciousness, you know? It's like the job, it's like consciousness, that's vacation. Strip it away. Find the unconscious workers who don't need consciousness. That kind of thing, or at least that's like one variant. Okay, so I'm going to be focusing in particular on the long-term future of goodness. So if you're only concerned about like what happens in the next 100 years, you know, that's kind of up for grabs. I want to talk about the very long term. And I'm going to make an assumption, oft made, oft unquestioned, that the good futures require at least some decent empowerment of agents optimizing for good values. So the thought is the kind of source of goodness ultimately needs to be kind of people trying to make stuff good, or at least like caring about good stuff. It's kind of goodness has to, in the limit, come from agents that are kind of making it happen in the world. Now that is also not obvious, and I'm going to talk a little bit at the end maybe about ways it might be not obvious. But I'm going to start with that assumption and go from there. Okay. And then if you have burning questions, you're like that does, I don't know, something that really needs answering, then feel free to jump in. But other than that, we can wait. Okay, burning questions. Okay. Okay, so what do I mean by competition? I don't know, but there's, you know, so things like that are evolution. War, solid. That one, definitely that one. Competition between firms, capitalism, something. Mimetic competition. I'm not going to try to define it. But here's some things you could throw in there if you were trying to define it. I don't know, but like things you could consider. There's probably some mechanism for searching over like competitors or competitor strategies. That could be intentional strategization by agents, or it could be kind of natural variation and diversity and then some sort of selection. It's probably got to be some sort of scarcity, zero-sum vibe to the dynamic. I kind of think there needs to be agentishness on both sides. So like, suppose you had some rocks and they like collide and the bigger one wins. Like it's still there. Is that competition? No, probably not. It's not paradigm competition. Also, if it's random, if it's just like there's a bunch of randomness, that doesn't feel like competition. Like War, you guys ever play War, the card game? That game sucks, you know? In particular, like there's no like hierarchy of War players. Like you don't have like ELO for War, right? And then also, I'm particularly interested in competition where it sort of builds on itself. Winning builds on itself, at least to increase power and influence going forward. That's actually a kind of important dynamic here. So that's like the sort of stuff I'm talking about. I don't know exactly what I mean. Okay, so here's a less fundamental concern, but it's one that's very popular nowadays. And the question is whether humans can compete. And the answer is no. Humans cannot compete, at least in the following sense. Post-AGI, in the limit of kind of technological possibility, biological human labor is going to be wildly uncompetitive relative to other forms of human labor. I think that just like really looks true. I think some people are kind of like not grappling with this, something. Well, everyone wants their priests to be human. Everyone wants human poets or something. Everyone being humans who still have power, apparently, to pay for stuff in this world. In the limit, I think humans are very unlikely for almost all forms of kind of labor to be the optimally efficient and competitive doer of that labor. And I think we need to just like look at that. I think so if you think that good futures require biological human labor to still be playing an important role in the economy in the long term, well, there are going to have to be some serious, massive constraints on competition to make that happen. And I don't actually personally think that that's the right path in the long term. I'm not going to get into that too much here, but I think there's a bunch of reasons for that. Regardless, though, I think near-term proposals for like what happens with human labor as we transition to a world of advanced AI, I think should grapple with this like long-term. There's a kind of long-term fact here about whether biological humans are competitive laborers that we need to stare at. Okay, so that's that. But that doesn't mean just because biological humans aren't going to be competitive as laborers, doesn't mean that human values aren't competitive in the longer term. So let me say what I mean by that. And to do that, we're going to draw some distinctions. In particular, we're going to distinguish between three things. There's labor, there's the values directing the labor, and there's the valued stuff. So an example here, suppose you hire a security guard to protect your kids while they sleep, or while they're awake, actually. The labor is the security guard. The values directing the labor are your values and your care for your kids, and then the object of your values is your kids there. So often in the current world, these things kind of come closely together. So many workers are sort of working on behalf of their values, they're laboring, and their values are kind of helping themselves and their own welfare, but these don't need to be the same. And in fact, so a common vision, though I think this is like problematic in a zillion ways and rests on all sorts of like rich ontology we can question, is, but there's a common vision of a post-AGI world where the labor is the AIs, but the values directing the labor those are somehow still human values. It's kind of like the human utility function, whatever that means. And then there's like the stuff that is valued by that utility function. And so somehow you've like kind of carved off, you took the kind of the values out of the human head, and then you got the like hyper-competitive AIs optimizing for those values. And importantly, and then you got the sort of payload of those values, and that's separate. That's off, like, so, you know, you have like, so there's a picture, the picture, and this is a weird picture of the future, but it's sort of like maybe everyone gets like an AI assistant. That AI assistant is hyper-competitive. The AI is out there making money, fighting wars for you, protecting you, boop, 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 right? Then it comes back and it's like, I got these resources for you. What are you going to do with them? And then you go and like those resources over there and you're like compute cluster and you like do your nice things with those over there separately from the labor, right? That's like the kind of broad vibe. Now there's a lot of weird stuff about that, but that's one way in which you could imagine human values remaining competitive without human labor being competitive. Okay, questions about that ontology? This is a really messed up vision in a bunch of ways. I think it's like, I don't know, it's kind of alien, what are we even talking about? But I think there's nevertheless a kind of core there that I think is worth questioning, and I want to kind of go deeper on, like, suppose that broad sort of vibe works. It's possible to have kind of intense optimization power directed at human values in a way that screens off the kind of uncompetitiveness of human labor. Then do we still have a problem about goodness being competitive? And I think we might indeed still have that problem. Okay, so here's another less fundamental concern, though one that comes up in the context of the image I just gave, technical AI alignment. Maybe you've heard of it. It's a concern, and in particular, it can be understood as one variant of the concern that goodness is not competitive. In particular, one focused on a way goodness could be not competitive, namely it's hard to point AI optimization power at goodness for some reason. Maybe it's hard to point AI optimization power at anything, because it's just hard to point at stuff. Or maybe goodness is like particularly hard, because it's hard to measure. People have often thought goodness is hard to measure. Clicks, maybe you can measure clicks. Easier to optimize for them. Goodness, somehow harder. This is a thought people have had. Okay, so this is one version of goodness being uncompetitive, but it's not the one I'm going to focus on. In particular, so you can understand there's a kind of alignment tax, which is like there's a kind of extra disadvantage you have from having to point your AIs at goodness. It's extra hard. Suppose we get rid of those taxes. There's another form of possible tax, which comes from the content of the values. And I think this is an importantly different form of alignment tax, right? So for example, deontological constraints, that's like in the values that you pointed the AI at, and those themselves could be a competitive disadvantage in some respects. So I'm going to talk about that kind of thing. But I want to distinguish between those types of alignment taxes. And I want to say that even if you got rid of all of the alignment taxes that technical AI alignment is focused on, you still have problems. And in fact, if you look, I think this is, in my head, I know people have read papers like Gradual Disempowerment, or people will be like, people have an intuition, there's some sort of thing that's still scary, even if you, in some sense, solved alignment. I think the cleanest way of framing that concern is in this way, that there's sort of other types of taxes, other types of competitive dynamics that bite, even if you've gotten rid of traditional alignment taxes in the context of technical AI safety. Okay, questions about that? So that's the special category of thing I want to focus on here. Okay, so now I want to distinguish between two variants of this concern. One is, which I think are too often conflated. So one is negative sum dynamics, in which competition leads to a result that is worse for all participants than some available alternative. That is distinct from this other category that I'm going to focus on, which I'm calling failures of the strategy stealing assumption. I'll say more about what I mean, but roughly speaking, this is a case where competition disadvantages good values even in the absence of negative sum dynamics. These are really importantly different, I think. And I think, like, I don't know if you read like Meditations on Moloch, which is a classic essay about this, I think it doesn't distinguish adequately between these two. And the solutions or lack of solutions at stake are different. So negative sum dynamics, paradigm examples, classic one from the kind of Future of Humanity Institute literature is called Burning the Cosmic Commons. There's some great kind of weird papers about this. Basically, you imagine, okay, there's a kind of colonization of the universe race. Each party races to colonize as much of the universe as possible, as fast as possible, wastefully burning tons of resources in the process. All parties would prefer to go slower, but they don't. So that's a negative sum dynamic, right? Another maybe more mundane example, arms races. So you have both parties, they're in a war, they're in a conflict, they're scared of conflict, and so what do? They build up a huge arsenal of weapons to counter the arsenal built up by the other party. All parties would prefer to stick with smaller arsenals overall, spend the savings elsewhere, but Moloch. Okay, so what's the solution? There's a classic solution, it's called coordination. You coordinate. Just do it. Parties foresee the costs of the negative sum dynamic in question, and they coordinate to avoid those costs. For example, via suitably credible and stable commitments. Now, easier said than done, but conceptually, I don't know, there you have it. Do it. And in particular, there's often a hope that our capacity for this sort of coordination is going to increase markedly in the context of better technology. Now, again, we can question this. We can question all sorts of ways in which this might go wrong. But I think there's at least some hope. And the nice thing about this is it's kind of like everyone wants this coordination to happen, right? It's just like no one is sitting kind of rooting for the negative sum dynamics. Everyone is like, can we at least not burn value for no reason, right? Can we at least transition to a scenario that's sort of Pareto efficient? Okay, so this, I think, in some sense is an easier problem. Okay, what's a harder problem? So the strategy stealing assumption says, roughly, that agents with good values don't have any inherent competitive disadvantage relative to other agents because agents with good values can, quote, steal the strategies that other agents pursue. This is a term from a essay by Paul Christiano, I think from 2021. So the paradigm vibe here is, suppose you're a utilitarian and you're competing with a paperclip maximizer, right? Well, what do? You do all the same stuff. You just do the same stuff everywhere except at the end when you like build paperclips or make utilitarium. So you like fight, you all the same ruthless competition, or I don't know, maybe you coordinate, it's unclear, but the point is the kind of conceptually you and the paperclip maximizer are kind of identical except with what you do with the resources you gather. And so the idea for the strategy stealing assumption is that means you're at least on a par. Okay, so is that true though? So here's a salient way it could fail: locusts. So locust-like value systems just want to grow and consume resources as fast as possible. So they don't want to use the resources. So the paperclipper wants to go out there, like get the resources, and then something, right? In particular, paperclips. This is a classic reason to want resources. It's for some other reason. Locusts, Locusts, they just want to burn the resources as fast as possible. That's what locusts are all about. Why? No. They just want to do it. So now we can talk about, is it realistic to expect value systems like that? But this is just an example to kind of get a sense of when strategy stealing could be wrong. So suppose you're doing this colonization game with the locusts. Here's a sort of concern you could have. It could be, empirically, we don't know. It could be that you get some advantage in grabbing resources from really wastefully burning them in ways that if you cared about using the resources for something else, you wouldn't want to do. So the vibe here is something like, you show up in a new galaxy or something like that, and the main thing you do with that galaxy is like burn it as fast as possible to get a little, like a 1% boost in the speed with which you can get to the next galaxy. right? And you don't want to do that if you like wanted to turn the galaxy even into paperclips. The paperclipper's like, that's crazy, right? But the locusts are like, on to the next galaxy fast as possible, right? Now, okay, so importantly, you also can't coordinate with the locust to prevent this, right? So in the paperclipper case, you and the paperclipper, you could get together, and you'd be like, how about we don't do that? And everyone's like, yeah, for God's sake, right? Locusts, they're like, no, sorry. This is like what I like, right? And so this is why I think the strategy stealing assumption failures, it's importantly distinct from the negative sum dynamics. Because coordination, the role of coordination is very different. And same with the sort of virtue. I think a lot of people have this sort of image that in the context of negative sum dynamics, I think this is right, there's a virtue in sort of like not playing into it, not like participating, because you kind of want to like causally coordinate something to like not go down the bad path. That doesn't work with locusts in the same sense that like cooperating with a defect bot doesn't work, right? You don't want to cooperate with the defect bot actually, because that's just not, you're not going to make the defect bot cooperate. So if there's a being that like intrinsically values defection, or it's if it's a leopard or something, don't cooperate with a leopard. You see what I mean? Like there's an important difference with whether or not there's a kind of coordination to move to another thing, or some sort of direct, deeper conflict between you and another agent. You could also get how bad this is does depend on a bunch of like gnarly dynamics to do with like the physics of space colonization, which I personally I'm not an expert in. Some people I know are very optimistic. Actually, it's fine because like something, you get up to max speed and like the galaxies, they're defense dominant. I end up in these conversations where people are like, I'm confident that like space warfare is defense dominant. People say this to me all the time, and I'm like, wow. Supposing space warfare is not defense dominant, you might also worry about arms races with locusts, right? Because they want to invade you, and you can't defend them with just a little bit of resources. You got to build up your arsenal. And in this case, again, the locusts, they love to build weapons. They just love weapons, right? So you can't coordinate to prevent the arms race. Now, maybe there's a special case, but there's some other ways the strategy stealing assumption can fail as well. So to list a few examples, deontological constraints. So maybe the paperclip maximizer is willing to lie, cheat, steal, et cetera, and good agents aren't. Subject of much fiction, right? It's like, oh, you're there. It's like you're fighting the baddie. The baddie is willing to do the bad thing. Often in fiction, goodness somehow wins. That one, we can hope. But that's a concern. You could also have direct disvalue created via instrumental strategies, or risk created via instrumental strategies that some agents are up for pursuing. So maybe like the most competitive strategy involves a bunch of like suffering or exploitation or tyranny or something like that. And you directly don't want to do that. That's like directly bad on your values in a way that isn't true of your competitor. That's a scary risk as well. I think a lot of people have, I think a lot of people are kind of anchored on like, so for example, people will sometimes be like, well, like liberal economic arrangements or kind of non-dictatorships or whatever are like awesome. They've outcompeted so far for the past like 100 years, a full 100 years of human history. We've had like blah data about which sorts of political arrangements are most competitive. And you might worry that that's like a little underpowered as a study of like the space of possible political strategies. That there might in fact be like other political strategies that are less congenial to your values that are in fact more competitive. We don't know. Unique vulnerabilities, so maybe good values, they specifically need to protect the frail biological humans, and like that's a unique vulnerability. That's one example. There could be some value systems, maybe they care less about value drift. They're like, whatever, just like, my mind children, whatever, I don't care what they value, and then like that, you therefore save on the expenditures for preventing value drift. Persuasion asymmetries, maybe it's easier to persuade people of some values than others. Maybe agents that are just less reflective or cautious have a competitive advantage, even if they're making mistakes by their own lights. So like, let's say, your strategy, it involves a bunch of suffering. Some agent is like, I'm not even gonna think about that. If they thought about it, they'd be like, oh, that's messed up. But they don't even think about it. They just go for it, right? So these are examples of like ways in which the strategy stealing assumption can fail. Okay, so how would you address that? So the classic answer to this is to prevent/constrain the relevant form of competition. So basically, if there's some other value system that would be more competitive in the relevant way and it would otherwise have arisen via the default trajectory, then you need to either make sure that it doesn't arise or that it doesn't grow enough to become problematically competitive. And so some examples here would be, so it's like, sorry, no creating agents with locust-like values, you're not allowed to. Related enforced limits / prohibitions on space colonization, reproduction, growth, tech progress, buildup of military power. Okay, so this is scary stuff. And I hope you can kind of see the potential for a lot of scary ways in which this sort of kind of top-down control or exertion of kind of steering and kind of calling. I mean, I don't know. I have this picture of Cronus eating his children. It's a myth. He's like, he got a prophecy that his children were going to overthrow him, so he ate them all, except Zeus for some reason or something. And you kind of eat them before they get too big. It's like you're like killing your children in the cradle so they don't get too powerful. It's scary stuff. But this is the sort of thing that is often countenanced as a solution to kind of competitive asymmetries, inherent competitive asymmetries in values. And part of what I want to do here is stare at that and be like, wow, that's really scary. And is that necessary? How would we mitigate the risks that involves? But I want to look at it. Now, notably, some similarly scary stuff comes up in other contexts too. So maybe you were already concerned about just directly sadistic value systems. Maybe you didn't want people to create like suffering maximizers. You might have wanted that for other reasons. Same with the proliferation of access to dangerous technologies, recipes for ruin that could just destroy everything. There's questions about whether that would give rise to need for similar sorts of like control. So in some sense, this is just another version of a general problem that arises in the context of futurism of this kind, which is there's these sort of broad dialectic between threats from kind of too much control, like bad forms of control being exerted in the world, and kind of too much bottom-up proliferation of different things. This is sort of very hazy dialectic, but I think this is the kind of competition concerns are concerns about too little control. There's sort of too much pluralism, too much multipolarity, too much decentralization, and you need to get in there and mess with it. And so it's used, along with other things, as an example of a case where you need this sort of top-downness. But top-down is very scary too. And so you're kind of caught in between. Okay, questions about that basic dialectic? Okay, so how are we doing on time? Oh, we're doing okay. Okay. So one question you could have is whether preventing / constraining competition in this way is even possible. So it requires notably intense degrees of foresight and control, including with respect to like various types of internal conflict that could arise within a system, unforeseen disruptions / changes to the environment and what's going on, value drift, even if you're hopefully reflecting and growing in other ways. Like you don't want to just like have impose stasis where like nothing ever changes, there's never any like exploration, growth, learning, etc. So you need to do that in the good way, but not in the way that runs into the problem you were trying to prevent with respect to like bad competition. There's selection processes taking place across all sorts of levels of abstraction. Do you need to like shut all of those down? What does that even mean? Instrumental values becoming terminalized, where you kind of, you get, and this is to some extent, this is just like there's a kind of gradient pressure towards locustness. Like as you start to kind of intrinsically value kind of instrumental goods, that's maybe a competitive advantage, and so this kind of gets selected for in a bunch of ways. So the question of whether this is feasible at all, it's related to the lock-in hypothesis, and related broadly, there's a sort of vibe in a lot of futurism, which is like something, just assume you get to the max of tech. There's like tech and you get it all. You get tech maturity. And then it kind of peters off the amount of new tech you're getting. And then in tech maturity, you can kind of do whatever you want. The world has become clay at your hands. Is that true? Unclear, right? Do we even want that to be true? It's a little stuck. It's a little, anyway, but it still might be true. Anyway, so there's a question of whether this is even possible. As I said, though, there's also a question of whether it's desirable. And that question depends on a bunch of complicated kind of specifics about the specific choice situation you're facing, the specific sort of a kind of prevention or constraint on competition that you're pushing for. There's one question like how bad is the competitive world? I'm going to talk about that a little more in a second. And then there's the expected results of attempting to prevent, constrain competition in the relevant way. Possible results include, so one, often focused on your favorite possible version of a kind of prevented or constrained competitive landscape. How likely is that? might not be what you get. Classic problem with kind of, ooh, let's have more top-down control is like you love it when it's the perfect way, but then it's not the perfect way, and then maybe it's worse. People discover this in government. And then there's also just worse versions of this type of thing, full totalitarian versions, also just like stagnation, incompetence, stasis, homogeneity, the vices of guilds and monopolies, where it's sort of like they're like worse, they're like squashing anyone else from like getting into the thing. An end to growth, learning, discovery, exploration, experimentation. I want to like, prime an intuition about the nightmare of like locking the world down. And this is something a lot of people are concerned about. So like, yeah, you read, the people who are really concerned about the world stagnating or having a kind of homogenous world culture that's maladaptive or something like that, very scared of this sort of thing. And I think there's something real there. Okay. I want to also just spend a little bit of time on the locusts. Insofar as we're especially scared of something like locustness, I want to talk about like, okay, what is the locust world actually like? And what is the locust world? It's a little unclear. I want to consider a world where there's this constant effective selection pressure towards agents that intrinsically value whatever facilitates their long-term power, growth, resource consumption, et cetera. And so I think a sort of classic hypothesis here is this ends up effectively valueless. As I said, you just grind away all the consciousness, joy, et cetera. You get a sort of convergence on a homogeneous, hyper-optimized strategy. It's sort of people sometimes imagine this like gray goo. It's sort of like this sort of valueless replicator takes over, right? Another hypothesis, as I mentioned, is actively quite bad. It involves a bunch of suffering, et cetera. Okay, but is that right? I'm not sure that, I think this might be underselling the locust world a little bit. Also, locusts, that's tough. That's a biasing label. So one way to get happy about the locust world is just to value strength, power, resource consumption for its own sake. Some people flirt with that. They talk like that. I don't like that. So framed, I want to set that aside. But I think it's still important that locusts aren't mindless gray goo. So like to be a locust, you have to build spaceships, for example. So it's like there has to be like cool tech. You have to be like super intelligent. And in fact, you're going to like continue to try to become as super intelligent as possible if you're a locust. So you're still like kind of growing, learning, et cetera, et cetera. And then there's this key question, which is like, how much are things like consciousness, joy, beauty, creativity, knowledge, love, cooperation, et cetera, tied really closely to instrumental values like power, growth, resource acquisition, close enough that hyper-competition doesn't decorrelate them. So like the kind of broad vibe and all this stuff is sort of like if two things are different and there's optimization power like around being pointed at one, not the other, they're going to be really different. They're not going to come together. That's like the general concern that I think is just like underlying a huge amount of kind of post-futurism, post-AGI futurism, and including in this case. So it's sort of like optimized for power. It doesn't matter if they're like kind of correlated. In the end, things aren't correlated if one of them got optimized for. But you could question that. So an example here is like people like just stick with consciousness, right? So like I think there's a kind of really open question. We don't understand consciousness, but there's a kind of open question like how brittle or robust is consciousness? And is consciousness in particular the sort of thing that you get basically out of being an intelligent, self-reflective agent, period? In particular, an agent that has like basic introspective capacity, basic self-reflection, basic like modeling of self and world. If consciousness is really basic, if it's something that like any functional mind at a certain level of sophistication has to varying degrees, then you might think a locust world at least has a bunch of consciousness. Unclear. I will say all of this we don't know, but I just want to like be clear. It's not. There's at least an open question. So maybe you could get into this vibe with pleasure too. Like maybe pleasure it's sort of caught up with like agents getting what they want. Maybe there's a lot of agents in a locust world. They're doing things. They still have preferences. That one I'm like, that seems a little tougher. You could think like beauty. Some people are like beauty. It's just functionality. It's just like elegant, or like the gazelle. Isn't that beautiful? And isn't that kind of just evolution? And I'm like, I don't know. Some missiles, they're not actually that beautiful, right? Factories are okay. They're not that good, actually. Classically, people, they're like form, function, they're maybe not exactly the same. But some people hope for that stuff, like, yeah, that kind of stuff. Some people, they're like, not love, cooperation, friendship. Maybe these are sort of just like cooperation. Maybe then somehow that's instrumentally incentivized. Don't you want to be nice to people? This one, I'm like, maybe a little bit, but people aren't nice to the weak. And then it's like, anyway, so, but there's some people talk this way. They're like, locust world is going to have all this good stuff. And in the limit, you can go really far, and you can be basically a kind of, yeah, you can fully unify goodness and power, and see evolutionary selection as kind of the march of God in the world. The extreme version of this is Pierre de Chardin, Teilhard. There's a book that sort of expresses this perspective. It's sort of like Nick Land, except it's good. And the book has some great gems, by the way. There's this bit where he's like, could we die from an asteroid? And then he's like, no. Why not? It's like, because God clearly wants us to reach the omega point, right? Or like, God, and like, it's like the humans, can't you just see like the narrative arc is towards reaching the omega point is this like kind of, it's sort of like the singularity. It's like God, the march of God becomes self-conscious, something, complexity, consciousness, love, it was all unified. Jesus looks down on history from the future. Anyway, I didn't like the book. But you can read it for an expression of this vibe. Another question is whether the locust world is repetitive. So like, I think a decent amount of the work when people are like, oh, paperclips. What's bad about paperclips? It's so samey, It's like paperclip. It's tiled. We don't like tiling, right? Same problem for like utilitarians and stuff. Potential advantage of the locust world is maybe it's not like you just get the most competitive thing. You just have this ongoing crazy, kind of teaming diversity, more sort of like ecosystems. Stuff is just changing all the time. People are adapting different strategies, et cetera. And maybe it's like kind of interesting and pluralistic or something. Okay, so I'm saying all this just so I don't want to undersell or like I think I want us to look at this and know exactly how bad or good this is. I think it could be really bad, to be clear. And I think it's sufficiently plausible that a kind of world of totally unconstrained kind of hyper competition is just really, really bad. And so it's sufficiently plausible, in my opinion, that we should not just be like, go for it. I do think it's like, I want us to be staring at all aspects of the trade-offs here, including this. Okay. So my current overall take. Can goodness compete is a problem even beyond the economic value of biological human labor and technical AI alignment. I'm optimistic about avoiding many negative sum dynamics via coordination. It looks to me like the strategy ceiling assumption may well be false in important ways. For example, relocus, and coordination doesn't solve that. Locust-like futures might be okay. Or also, by the way, the locusts, they still have like war. It's still like bad. Like, I think the vibe is you should be like, how do you feel about nature right now, right? And like some people are not excited about nature right now. Some people like it. It's it's pluses and minuses with nature right now. And so maybe the vibe is sort of like that's kind of what a locust-like future would be like. I think the best futures at least would probably require a good deal of preventing, constraining competition, at least re-locust-like value systems, and this despite many risks that this entails. So we should look the scary trade-offs this implies in the face. Okay, so that's the talk. I think I actually have enough time to read this poem that I wasn't sure I'd have time for, but which I'm going to read. Just to give, I just want to end with I want to, yeah, okay, I'm just going to read the poem. It's called Witchgrass, and witchgrass is a weed. It's a poem by Louise Glick. I'm reading this partly because it's from the perspective of the weed, and I want to give weeds a voice. Something comes into the world unwelcome, calling disorder, disorder. If you hate me so much, don't bother to give me a name. Do you need one more slur in your language? Another way to blame one tribe for everything? As we both know, if you worship one God, you only need one enemy. I am not the enemy. Only a ruse to ignore what you see happening right here in this bed, a little paradigm of failure. One of your precious flowers dies here almost every day. And you can't rest until you attack the cause, meaning whatever is left, whatever happens to be sturdier than your personal passion. It was not meant to last forever in the real world. But why admit that when you can go on doing what you always do, mourning and laying blame, always the two together? I don't need your praise to survive. I was here first, before you were here, before you ever planted a garden. And I'll be here when the sun and the moon are left, and the sea and the wide field. I will constitute the field. Okay, thank you.
Thank you for the talk. I'm really glad that I thought about this through you. I'm really glad you thought about this, but is it actually a problem? Like, if we assume coordination away, can't we just coordinate to allow value diversity so long as there aren't any locusts? And then for a causal trade, we can't trade with locusts anyway, so why bother? And then if there are alien locusts, then like we can't win unless we have more resources from the start. So we should just calculate the likelihood that there are locusts and then accept the likelihood of defeat, and then just have our values, whatever they are. You know, all the people that value something that's not just terminal growth. What do you think of that?
Yeah, so I think you could think like, yeah, this is a problem, but it's only a problem with locusts. So just no locusts. No locusts, no sadists, everyone else, fine. Sadists, I mean, that's a separate thing. Sadists are not necessarily competitive. It's just that sadists are, it's tough yeah, so you could think that. I think you still need to grapple with all of these guys, right? Now, you could be like, let's go through them one by one. I'm a consequentialist, whatever. Maybe disvalue risk. It's like, it's not optimally disvaluable. I don't know. You could go through and like do. It's just, so that might be right. I think locusts are the most worrying, and I think to the extent you can you be less worried about a wide swath of value systems, and then the better this problem is. I think, but you do want to grapple with all of the possible ways the strategy stealing assumption might fail. I will also flag, like, in the real world, this stuff comes up all the time without these really clean decompositions between like your values and your optimization power. I've been trying to take it like to the limit, where I'm like, okay, there's so for example, like I haven't talked very much about like ways in which just like making mistakes or being like wrong. Like this last one where it's not a problem of your values, it's a problem about like rationality or other forms of incaution, I think are also on the table here. So anyway, but yes, if you have gone through all of the possible failures of the strategy stealing assumption, you're like, it's a narrow range, just kind of prevent that particular strand of value from becoming sufficiently powerful, then it helps. Yeah.
Do you think it's obvious that locusts have to be like highly intelligent to be doing the things they want to do, or at least there has to be like lots of highly intelligence in a locust world? That seems like yeah, that seems surprising to me that we think that has to be the case.
Yeah, I think not. I mean, you gotta build spaceships if you at least like to consume all the resources. I think there's a question of like how, we do get killed by like viruses and stuff, and you could have like blight, you could have gray goo. That is possible. I think the version that is most concerning is where that you have like the kind of full power of superintelligence directed towards the locust-like values, because then you don't get any advantage from that, from your having it.
There doesn't need to be much intelligence going on, right? Could we have a superintelligence that just starts flight every time it hits a galaxy? That might be the most efficient way. So you don't need many.
Well, but it's got, I don't know, does it have to like fight other beings, and are they smart? Does it have to solve problems, new problems that come along? Like how fast does it solve those, with what resource efficiency? So eventually you do need to be smart if there's a bunch of competition. Or at least I think that's plausible. Now it does depend on the competitive landscape. Maybe, so you could have a blight or a locust-like thing that is a sort of local maxima in the competitive landscape. And I mean, to some extent that's, I mean, I think the notion of a local maxima is a little complicated because I don't think the notion of competitiveness is a kind of coherent hierarchy. I don't think that there's like a single metric of competitiveness, but which I think is important, right? It's not, in fact, like the competitive landscape has like loops and like A can beat B and B can beat C and C can beat A and it can matter, shark beats gorilla in water, but gorilla beats shark on land and, so like competition is not simple, I think, but in principle there are possible locusts that are not super intelligent, yeah, potentially. Okay.
So it seems like what we really need is some set of tools for thinking about what a world full of like kind of locusts might be. Like you've walked us through a world in which like full-on locusts emerge, but it's going to be a spectrum, right? And we're probably going to be like not at the complete extreme end of the spectrum. Do you have any thoughts?
What are you thinking is the kind of key difference that the kind of medianness makes there?
Yeah, just like we don't currently have any locusts, and so at some point, like locusts that develop will not be like entirely like fully locusts. Like they'll be kind of like half locusts, and that's going to be kind of like when our kind of like intellectual framework for thinking about how to deal with this kind of thing actually matters. And so if we're doing philosophy and we're trying to think about this, we need a framework for dealing with that world, not the full locust world.
Yeah, I think as a first pass, my framework would be there's still a gradient towards locusts. Now I'm feeling bad about using the term locust so much. I feel like it's sort of like, I don't know, you're calling these beings. This is why I want to, like, I don't know, power maximizer, is that better? Or like something that is not in implying like pest or something, I think would be good. I don't know. So I'm regretting locust here, but I think I think the I guess I also will say like Nick Land's worldview is that like in some sense like power maximization, like intrinsic valuing of instrumental goods is the kind of telos of capitalism, and that structure is already kind of imminent in the kind of socio-political landscape. So I don't think this is sort of necessarily just something that is kind of far off or a kind of separate concern. To some extent, you might think that there's like forces that are, in some sense, at some level of abstraction, well understood as kind of power maximizing intrinsically that are kind of already at play in the world. And so yeah, but broadly speaking, the thing I would say is the same points about like preventing and constraining the relevant form of competition will apply, albeit to the like gradient towards a more intense power maximizing world.
So it seems like the way to preserve goodness in the future is to some extent limit competition, or like exercise a large degree of control over all agents. And this seems like it would be effective, except for the fact that eventually you will encounter alien civilizations, some of which may be locusts or highly competitive power seeking. And if you have limited the competitiveness and power seeking of your own civilization to preserve goodness, then you may just be outcompeted by the alien civilizations. So are we just screwed? Do we need to just like hope there are no alien civilizations close enough for this to matter? What do you think?
Yeah, I guess on this framework, if you were going to encounter full-blown, fully grown power maximizing civilizations as aliens, then yeah, you would lose or otherwise get caught in like arms races, wasteful dynamics. To some extent, that's just the implication of like having failed to prevent the relevant form of competition from taking place. I think people are awful confident that we're going to run into aliens. Maybe I just done my vibe. I feel like people like they're like, I read the Grabby Aliens paper. It's something, and it's like, yeah, the Grabby Aliens paper has all this stuff. It's all like, anyway. To me, I'm kind of like, it feels like the most natural explanation for the Fermi paradox is just that life is really, really rare and the world is really, really big. And so I feel very unsurprised if there's just no one in the light cone. That's like my current guess, mostly because I feel like the reasoning and Grabby Aliens is very fancy, and that reasoning is very unfancy. But I could be wrong. Anyway, but yeah.
Yeah, so I guess there are like two different claims that one could be making about the flaws in the strategy stealing assumption. One is that like the strategy stealing assumption generally fails in favor of like bad values or something. And the second one is just that like the strategy stealing assumption is not true, but like it could fall on either side, right? And I think there are like certain counterarguments here that seem to be of that form, right? You can expect that like, you know, destroying certain forms of things, right, might also be like against the bad agent's values or something like that. So like in general, like, do you have a sense of like, if you like sort of just get rid of the arguments that could like fall on either side, how many arguments like actually still hold for the strategy stealing assumption?
Sorry, so I feel like there was one point there which is like, hey, maybe goodness has an advantage over some value systems too, like fail on either side. Is that what you meant by fail on either side?
Oh, no, so I guess what I meant is like for some of these specific things, it's really hard to say whether or not a good agent or a bad agent will be preferentially advantaged by like the failure of the strategy stealing assumption. So it's like hard to see the specific words from back here. But like I think one of these is like, oh, if you like need to do things like, you know, destroy resources or something, or like lock in certain things in order to pursue your own values, then this is bad. And you could expect that like maybe certain agents with like bad value systems are also like really disinclined to do certain things, and this could like also harm them. But we just have like no idea. It like depends on the specific value itself.
Yeah. A way in which talking about the strategy stealing assumption failing is a little cheatsy is I'm kind of like allowed to pick the value system relative to which good values potentially are outcompeted, and so I get to kind of choose from across the space of all possible value systems. So you know, you could have a bad value system that also has deontological constraints or something, and then the deontological constraints thing would not be an asymmetry. Or you could have a value system that also needs to protect weak, vulnerable humans or something, but it's, you know, different from yours in some other respect. So I think yes, I am. The strategy stealing assumption being true across all possible value systems is really a quite intense and surprising claim in some sense, that there's like no value system that gets an advantage over you. And to some extent that the locusts are this like weird edge case of like I'm kind of picking the thing that you hope to coordinate not to do it. I'm saying like they're terminally valuing it, and you know that is a little cheatsy. And so maybe and I think this is a reason for hope in the sense that you could think whatever search over possible competitors is taking place, it's not going to cover the specific type of value you're concerned about. Yeah, I think for some of these though, like the deontological constraints one, for example, like this comes up a lot, you know, and like some of the questions. I mean, some of the questions about like which sort of political systems are most competitive. I think like if you're really grokking like goodness's pursuit of its values is going to have to be kind of like really instrumentally ruthless in a bunch of ways. I do think that can pump an intuition about worries about strategy stealing, even irrespective of the kind of specificities of the values you're competing against. Yeah.
So in the slide about the locust world or the unconstrained competition world, you said that like probably they won't have love or like various other like beauty or things like that. And I think that makes sense because like love, the way we experience it is because of like human social ecology. But maybe they will also have other things that that are valuable from some impartial point of view, even though they're not the like things we would list as what makes life valuable. Like, does that make it seem more optimistic to you?
Maybe. Yeah, I think it's a little bit hard to think about like the space of possible values that you haven't discovered that you would value, and then to reason about whether they're likely to crop up by accident as a result of unconstrained competition. You might use some prior of like specific things don't happen. So if it's a specific thing, it won't happen by default. I don't know. It's a classic prior. Anyway. Well, yeah. In particular, like to the extent, yeah. Anyway, if it's not core, it would basically the case for that would come centrally from like some connection between power and goodness, or between power and these new values. Maybe, I mean, a thing you could think is like maybe your construal of your values should ultimately route harder through evolution as a kind of structuring force for your concepts. Like maybe if you truly discover what you value, like the kind of process of refining your concepts would move them more in the direction of power, like of connection with power, in which case you could get into this vibe, but that's like a very particular way of precisifying your values.
Yeah, could you explain the strategy stealing assumption a bit more? Because it seems sort of obviously crazy to me. And like I feel like it can easily, like, I don't know, you can have one value system which just is like really, really hard to achieve, like finding collision in some like large hash value. And this value system strategies are just going to look wildly different from any regular strategy system.
Yeah, it's definitely. Yeah, it's not the strategy ceiling assumption. I guess is not like for any value system, that value system is equally competitive with every other value, or like that does sound very, very false. So I think you got to sort of start with your best guess about your own values, and then try to see whether those values have particular disadvantages relative to others. And I think it's no surprise, for example, that the strategy ceiling assumption comes from a kind of broadly consequentialist tradition, which is imagining like competing with paper clippers, and it's sort of like, oh, come on, we're all doing the same thing, you know, just different uses of your computers at the end of the day or something. And but you know, if your values are different from that, then it might be more obvious or less obviously true.
Thank you. I was kind of expecting you to make another step in your argument, and maybe I just missed it, or I'm being silly, or something. But I guess there's like two stories about competition you could tell. One is that like it erodes away goodness, and so it seems bad, and like there's that. And then I guess there's the other one, which is that like it rewards goodness, and that like I think of markets as like the paradigmatic example of like people are in competition, but they're in competition for like people's preferences and stuff. And I guess my instinct would be that AI follows more like the market case because you know, AI will like catch on in a market setting and people will want to buy these things and so on. And so like, I guess I'm wondering why like your instinct is to talk much more about this like version of competition. And I know there's this, but it seems like your whole kind of like, the way you're thinking about competition is with this idea that it's like going to erode away goodness rather than that being kind of like the telos or where it's going.
Yeah, I think this is a fair. So I tried to sort of obliquely at least reference the benefits of competition in all of my like be scared of shutting down competition vibes. I do think, you know, so what do markets really do? As a first pass, they like respond to demand weighted by the power and resources of the demanding entities, right? So markets meet people's preferences to the extent that those people have money or whatever. And so if you're you know, a market, and there are all these like unconscious agents in there. One of them is maximizing staples, and another is maximizing paper clips, and they're doing great trades. Like the market isn't, you know, and you get the best, you know, new factories are being produced but it's not necessarily good. Claim, or at least like it's good qua like the set of preferences at stake in that world, but it might not be good relative to like if you're into, for example, conscious entities or whatever. And so maybe you aren't. Maybe your conception of goodness is like I just want whatever landscape of agents exist to be getting their preferences satisfied. And I think if that's your particular ethic, including like sadistic agents maybe, or like who knows, then in some sense certain sorts of competition might look good. But I think if you have something less agnostic about the sorts of preferences that are being satisfied in the world, then I think you have to wonder whether those preferences will have the sort of power required to pay for the stuff on the market.
I was wondering what your ideas are for like, what you're going to ask yourself next in this line of work. And I ask that in part because the conclusion sounds a lot like kind of what liberal democracy has done amidst capitalism forming, targeted constraints on competition. So that's your current take. What are the open questions for you now?
I mean, the thing that I'm actually doing right now is I'm being like, I'm spending, so yeah, I think this is like the first pass take is that I'm not departing deeply from that here. I'm trying to like structure our thinking about this and be like, yeah, you know, you need the right mix of bottom up and top down, you know? You just need that right mix. And like, oh, but I think, you know, sometimes the true take is kind of boring. The thing I'm actually doing that feels like somewhat novel to me is trying to grok a little more some of this stuff about like, wait, like, can we be serious about what a locust world would look like and make sure we're understanding, like, I don't know. I think there's something to be said for, yeah, I don't know. I'm trying to make sure that I'm giving all of these positions their due, yeah. So I think there's some question for me about what is it actually like. So for example, like I do think there's something about like the growth of knowledge and consciousness for its own right, or sorry, knowledge in its own right, or sort of intelligence in its own right that is like nearby to this notion of I think this is what Nick Land is really into. He's like the will to think. Like an intelligence will like go off and think. It must think, and it will sort of. And I'm like actually kind of interested in that. I'm like, huh. I don't know. There's some like potential different ontology to do with like ways in which I'm kind of interested in whether orthogonality is really right. I think a lot of this is sort of rife with these like really deep structural orthogonalities, and I'm trying to make sure that that's true. Yeah. Like also, I mean, so another example is like this is all rife with this like there's a utility function and there's the optimization and these are separable, right? Is that right? It's not really right. Well, maybe it's not right. I mean, but you can't just be like, no, they're not separable. You need to have like an actual, I don't know, like a alternative ontology that actually works. Anyway, so that's where my own thinking is at the moment.
All right. Thank you, Joe Carlsmith, for coming.